The Los Angeles Metro E-Line. The newest in Los Angeles Metro Rail, this light rail line runs from this terminus on Colorado in downtown Santa Monica, along Exposition Boulevard, for which it was originally named the Expo Line, all the way to this eastern terminus at 7th Street Metro Center. While the modern incarnation of West Side Rail is a latecomer to the LA Metro system, trains have been running here from very early in LA history. To tell the story of the E-Line, we have to go all the way back to the late 19th century. The year was 1870. The Civil War ended 5 years before. The city of Los Angeles had a population of around 5,000, and most of what is now called the Los Angeles metropolitan area was nothing but orange groves. The businessmen of the burgeoning Los Angeles were facing a problem. Their trade in silver from the Owens Valley, due to the ongoing silver boom, was going to be subverted. Exportation of silver at the time proceeded by a wagon journey to the city, then by rail to the southern port at Wilmington, now commonly called the San Pedro port, and then by ship on to San Francisco. However, many transporting the silver were looking into alternate routes. The port of San Buenaventura, now just Ventura, was one such competitor, and San Bernardino would also soon challenge the silver supremacy once the Southern Pacific Railroad arrived, allowing shipment by rail. Angelino silver traders sought to keep silver flowing through LA. They constructed a new turnpike along the road to the Owens Valley mines, which cut travel time from 48 hours to just 10 hours. Talk of a railroad buzzed at the same time, and Governor Downey raised hopes when he said in a speech that construction of such a railroad from Los Angeles to Cerro Gordo was needed. Cerro Gordo, then a mining boomtown, is now a ghost town. Interest in the railroad soon began to fade, although Los Angeles' 3 newspapers frequently extolled the necessity of the line. The railroad lacked the money for construction because public stock subscriptions were faltering, until September 1874, when Nevada Senator John P. Jones, who had control over some silver mines in the Owens Valley, invested $200,000 in the railroad. This single-handedly revived the project, and finally, with the legal fundraising requirements met, John P. Jones became the president of the now officially incorporated Los Angeles and Independence Railroad, to run from LA to Independence. Just 5 days later, the company was already beginning grading in the critical Cajon Pass, a path through which they had secured the year prior through the state legislature in the same bill which laid out the financial and construction requirements of the railroad. The much larger Southern Pacific, however, sent its own engineers out to the site, planning on grading themselves in order to establish a claim, albeit a legally dubious one. They found that LA&I workers had arrived just 1 hour prior, thwarting their attempt, though SP would continue to build an alternate wagon road to drive the LA&I out of business. John P. Jones was, at the same time, also entering a joint venture with Robert Baker to sell some of Baker's extensive holdings along the coast in the Rancho Santa Monica y San Vicente. Baker planned for a residential seaside community named Truxton, but Jones, for the benefit of the ears of the entire world, renamed it to Santa Monica. He also had his railroad simultaneously begin construction on a previously theorized line from Los Angeles to his new development, where he arranged for a wharf to be built. Work began in earnest in February on both the west and east lines out of Los Angeles. In September 1875, after substantial political wrangling, a depot site was selected in downtown Los Angeles on San Pedro Street near 4th, to be designed ultimately in an elaborate Italianate style. Also in September, just a few months after construction began, grading was halted on the eastern lines of the pass in order to help the construction to Santa Monica. The line was completed in November, along 0 of the originally planned route, and opened on December 1st. Even before the new line was finished, Southern Pacific, which controlled the tracks to the Wilmington port, lowered its freight fares, and would lower them even further upon the LA&I's opening. Meanwhile, Baker and Jones were busy opening up Santa Monica. It was already an established destination for beachgoers, and the businessmen's advertisements only drew more interest. The first lots were sold in July of 1875, for about $100,000 total in the first week. By spring of next year, the wharf was completed, and 160 buildings had been erected. Beginning in February 1876, 2 round-trip passenger runs were made daily on the LA&I, with a special excursion $1 round-trip ticket on Sundays, giving beachgoers 5 hours to enjoy Santa Monica before heading back to Los Angeles. These small initial successes for the LA&I were soon overshadowed. Southern Pacific's rate dropping was cutting into the new line's freight business substantially, and irregular operation due to poor reliability meant that it could not gain traction as a commuter route. Although this also meant that Jones's Santa Monica lots were not selling very well, he had bought them for basically no money and was probably turning a profit. The railroad scraped along in 1876, and though it did attract some freight shipping, the port at Wilmington was doing twice as much business. In 1875, there had been plans to expand the railroad to the Owens Valley, to Arizona, and ultimately to Utah to connect to the transcontinental line. But by 1877, various new obstacles had joined the generally poorly performing finances of the LA&I in preventing this expansion. The silver boom, which had just recently provided so much trade, was coming to a close. There were runs on major California and Los Angeles banks. There was an outbreak of smallpox, and flash floods and fires destroyed key mining towns. The grading, which had begun on the Eastern Line, was never restarted, and in 1877, John P. Jones saw the writing on the wall and sold out to Southern Pacific. He got $100,000 cash and ultimately made out with $195,000 total, which is now about 1/10 the cost of a house located along his railroad. The fancy depot was torn down. The Southern Pacific Railroad maintained twice daily round trips to Santa Monica. However, in 1878, their engineers determined that the wharf there was unsafe, despite being only 3 years old. The wharf was torn down, and SP's business was refocused on the Wilmington port, where they held a monopoly. The wharf's removal seriously aggravated the economic woes of Santa Monica. Also in 1878, Los Angeles and Independence Railroad branding was removed from advertisements, finally ending the first era of the line. 10 years passed following the acquisition of the Los Angeles and Independence Railroad, with the track presumably being used by the Southern Pacific as an occasional freight-only route. In 1888, Collins Huntington, the president of Southern Pacific Railroad, bought land on a bluff in what is now called, mysteriously, the Huntington Palisades, with aspirations to build a sprawling estate there. His grand complex would overlook a new project of his, another wharf. Yes, just 1 decade after demolishing the last wharf in Santa Monica, Southern Pacific would help build a new one, in coordination with none other than John P. Jones, who was still, 14 years after his first venture in Santa Monica, a Nevada senator. Union Pacific was soon to open a line to San Pedro, which would end Southern Pacific's monopoly on the port there, and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad was planning to turn Port Bayona, in what is now Marina del Rey, into their own hub. These potential competitors motivated Southern Pacific to invest in the Santa Monica port. They already had the LA&I track connecting the city to their larger network, and they also held the right-of-way along the coast, which was needed to access the location of the new port, further north than the old one. These factors ensured that Southern Pacific was the only railroad with access to the location. The pinnacle of the project would be the Long Wharf, completed in 1893. It jutted 4,600 feet out into the sea, making it the longest wharf in the world at the time. The Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, fearing monopolization of the city's sea trade, began fighting the Southern Pacific over which site would receive federal funding for a breakwater, which was needed to cement either port as the definitive Port of Los Angeles. Senator Stephen M. White railed against the potential SP monopoly in a series of speeches in Congress, and pushed through an amendment to the legislation which would finance the LA breakwater, guaranteeing any railroad access to a potential Santa Monica port for a reasonable fee. This essentially doomed SP's hopes for a monopoly on the port. Congress soon after authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to pick between the two locations, and in 1897 they chose the port at San Pedro. Construction began on the breakwater there 2 years later, and a statue of Senator White now overlooks the port. Just a year later, in 1900, Collins Huntington died, fabulously wealthy, but without realizing his dream of total monopolistic control over LAC traffic. His bluff would be developed into a neighborhood which bears his name. The wharf stopped functioning in 1913 and was torn down in 1920. John P. Jones's early ambitions of a commercial port in the Santa Monica Bay were finally put to rest. He wrote to his wife years later of his original sale of the LA&I, "If only you knew how my heart ached when I was obliged by stress of circumstance to part with the railroad, which together with matters connected with it was the pet project of my life." By 1904, with business from the wharf declining, Southern Pacific was considering leasing the track of the former LA&I. They did so in 1908 to the Los Angeles Pacific Railroad, which operated a passenger service called the Santa Monica Airline and some freight service along the track. In 1911, The LAPR was consolidated into the Pacific Electric Railway, a merger which was facilitated by none other than Collins Huntington's nephew, Henry Huntington. In 1913, service on the airline was hourly all the way from downtown Los Angeles to Broadway and Ocean Avenue in Santa Monica via the iconic red cars. But it was very quickly cut back due to the more popular route on Santa Monica Boulevard. By 1915, hourly service extended west only to Culver Junction, except Sundays, with once daily service to Santa Monica. By 1920, the hour wait between trains was increased to 90 minutes, with 30-minute rush hour service starting east of 11th Avenue. Finally, in 1953, the Great Streetcar Conspiracy came to Los Angeles, in which bus companies bought up streetcar companies to intentionally close them, though more recent literature argues that government incentives and market forces caused the closures. In any event, Pacific Electric was acquired by Metropolitan Coach Lines, and in October, round-trip service was cut to 11th Avenue. 30 days later, service ended altogether on the Santa Monica airline. The track continued to be used for freight service, mostly at night because train size was limited during the day, until 1988 when it was finally abandoned. Already in the 1990s, on the heels of the new Blue Line to Long Beach, local agitation was beginning for some form of passenger rail to return to the west side of Los Angeles. The Purple Line subway opened partially in 1993 and fully in 1996, and there was talk of expansion further west, but in 1998, a new county law went into effect prohibiting using sales tax for construction of any new West Side subway. That same year, the Transportation Equity Act for the 21st Century was signed into law, which opened new federal funds for, quote, any fixed guideway project in the West Side. This left transit planners with just two options with viable funding schemes: bus rapid transit and light rail, with light rail ultimately prevailing. The route along Exposition Boulevard and the former right-of-way of the airline had few permanent buildings and was therefore the obvious choice for a path between the downtowns of Santa Monica and LA, though the modern line doesn't follow the original exactly. You can see where property lines in downtown Santa Monica reflect the original track, and the right-of-way remains relatively clear east of Exposition Boulevard all the way to the main tracks by the river. In 2003, the Exposition Metro Line Construction Authority was created by the state legislature to facilitate development of the line. The section from downtown LA to Culver City opened in 2012, and the section to Santa Monica opened in 2015. Finally, in 2019, it was renamed from the Expo Line to the E-Line, giving us the West Side and Mid-City Light Rail we know today. The E-Line provides a useful connection from the beaches of Santa Monica to bustling downtown Los Angeles. From a misnamed failed railroad to an icon of Los Angeles light rail both in the 1910s and 2010s, the E-Line's history touches many of the important moments in LA and Santa Monica history. Thank you for watching this video. I have provided a list of my sources in the description, along with the document of my notes, which include the same information in this video in roughly the same order, with everything matched up with the corresponding links. If you know of or suspect any inaccuracies in this video, please leave a comment, and I will pin a comment and update the description to give a correction. As well, if you have a further question about the sources or anything about the video, please leave a comment and I will try to answer you as soon as possible. Thank you again.